Hello, my name is Robert Ellwood, a resident of Crotona and a member of the lodge there, an emeritus professor of religion from the University of Southern California, and I will be introducing the series on world religions that the lodge will be studying this season. Now, what do we talk about when we talk about religion? I think religion is one of those words that everybody thinks they know what it means until they begin to try to define it precisely, what is included, what is not included, and that sort of thing. And it turns out very often to be far more complex and difficult an idea than you might think first off. To begin with, there is one distinction that should be made, and that is between personal religion and the religion as a descriptive term. The personal religion, you say, well, my religion is such and such, I don't believe in all of those rituals and doctrines and so on, but I just do live in a certain way. Well, that's wonderful, that's fine. But the descriptive side of it comes in when we try to talk about those institutions that have usually been considered religious institutions in the long history of human beings, and they certainly have included many different ideas, rituals, doctrines, teachings, ethical practices, and much else. Our discussion in this series will be basically about those institutions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, the Chinese and Japanese religions, and so forth. Even here, a couple of caveats perhaps should come in. One is that the idea of a religion, usually ending in the word ism, is really a pretty modern concern that comes out of the expansion of European influence when explorers encountered what they considered to be other and sometimes wrong-headed religions in other parts of the world. And so all of the very many paths that make up Hinduism, for example, were encompassed under that name. Buddhism too, even though for a long time the Europeans didn't even know that the Buddhism of East Asia, of China and Japan, ultimately was the same that they encountered in the Southeast Theravada Buddhist countries like Thailand and Burma and so on. It's very convenient, certainly for purposes of study, to talk about these religions, but it should also be borne in mind that it's kind of an abstraction, and it wasn't until modern times that ideas like Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and so on came in. And there are those who argue that this kind of categorization is misleading because in the last analysis, probably all of the world's 7 billion people or whatever it is now really have their own religion or their own lack of religion in their own way. To think that if you know what the generic religion is all about, you may or may not really understand that individual. But anyway, we'll be dealing primarily here with descriptive religions. And so that brings back the question again, how do we understand religion, what it is, in a way that will help us to understand the great religious traditions? Well, you've probably heard about split-level houses. From the point of view of religions, the entire universe is a split-level operation. To explain that, I'd like to borrow a couple of terms from Buddhism: conditioned and unconditioned reality, because I think they're fairly neutral compared to those that might come from somewhere else. When we say that something is conditioned, we say that it has limits or conditionings on it. An insurance policy will only operate under certain conditions, and so forth. And by the same token, I think we can say that our lives here in this world are conditioned in all sorts of ways. We're born at a certain time and we will die at a certain time. We are limited by the fact that we usually can't think more than one or two thoughts at the same time. by the fact that we are only in one place at one time. If I'm here in Ojai, say, I'm not also in Hong Kong or the planet Neptune or somewhere else. If I'm here in the 21st century, I'm not also up in the 25th century with Buck Rogers, and so forth. So we're limited, we're conditioned. But what if there was something that was unconditioned, that was unlimited in any of these ways, that could think any number of thoughts at the same time, that was in all times and in all places simultaneously? Well, religions usually postulate there is some reality of this sort. Call it God, call it Allah, call it Nirvana, Brahman. It has a quality of being unconditioned or unlimited, and in that way is set apart from the world as we experience it. Now, you might say, and I think many people do, that maybe there is something unconditioned out there, but how can I have any access to it or know about it? All I can do is live my life as best I can with the conditions that are imposed upon me. But religion says not only are there these two levels, but there are also doors and windows between the two. Windows whereby the divine, if we may call it that, the unconditioned reality, can see what is going on in this world. Doors through which the divine, in one way or another, can send down revelations, such as the Quran transcribed by the Prophet Muhammad in Islam, or even an incarnate deity like Krishna or Jesus Christ from the Christian point of view. And the doors and windows go the other way too. They say there are ways in which we on our side can see into the nature of divine reality, probably through these revelations, books, prophets, teachers, avatars, and so on. And by the same token, can sometimes even, as it were, step into the other side and experience the divine life in very deep mystical experience, or perhaps more often acted out in some kind of ritual performance in which you take part. So religion begins with the idea of a split-level universe with doors and windows between the two. Now, the next thing I might like to talk about is how this fits in with Theosophy, because this is basically a theosophical class, at least through the lodge, though it's certainly open to anyone. And I'd like to look at something that H.P. Blavatsky said in Isis Unveiled, her first important book, in which she said, "Truth remains one, and there is not a religion, whether Christian or heathen, that is not firmly built upon the rock of ages, God and immortal spirit." So two basic things, God and immortal spirit, and I think those two things fit in very well with the split-level universe we just talked about. God represents the unconditioned reality side of it. Immortal spirit represents us in this world who are trying to learn more about God, and by the same token more about our own ultimate nature, which from the religious point of view is a immortal spirit, according to Blavatsky here. And I think whatever religion's precise beliefs on the afterlife, there is always a kind of struggling towards seeing how our lives are more than just the way in which we are forced to live under the conditions of this particular life, with its beginning and end and its limitations to our thought and experience, and indeed to our deep joy. So when she says God and immortal spirit, we're talking about these two ways in which religions try to deal with the issue of what is the ultimate nature of the universe, what is the ultimate nature of ourselves. And she also goes on to say, the remote past during those ages when every true religion was based on knowledge of the occult powers of nature. In other words, presenting the basic theosophical idea that the great religions of the world are conveyors of the ancient wisdom, that is, the supreme knowledge about God and immortal spirits that was known to humans at the very beginning of human experience, one way or another. Not always, I think, just in verbal terms, but in terms of the ultimate questions that we ask and the deepest kind of experiences that we can have. Even those mystical experiences through which we might step through the door into the unconditioned side. So, in studying the world religions then, we are studying something that is very important to Theosophy. Religion, in both the Mahatma letters and HPB's writings, have often been severely criticized. And yet I think ultimately the criticisms have been of abuses of it, of ways in which it has been too self-limiting, getting away from the primal truth that it was really supposed to convey for something that worked in terms of the economics and politics and so on of its own particular time, which, sorry to say, we still see in the world around us. But the ultimate question then is, how do we go from here? And I think the next thing to talk about in terms of understanding the religious institutions of the world is that I would like to talk about the three forms of religious expression. These are according to the historian of religion Joachim Bach, who, after being exiled from Germany, taught in the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, where I also got my degree in history of religions, although that was a little after Bach's time and of his successor, the Mircea Eliade, the historian of religion. Anyway, Bach talks about three forms of religious expression. And here is where we go from the two sides of the doors and windows to look at it in terms of how exactly do these religions work in the actual world in which they find themselves. The world of human thought, human action, human group forming, sociology, and like that. And he said that there are basically three forms of religious expression, three ways in which religions act out their narratives about the doors and windows. The first he called the theoretical, maybe a little misleading term, because what is basically encompassed in it is myth and doctrine, the stories the religions tell, and the way in which these are summarized in doctrine. The second part is what he called the practical, also a somewhat misleading term in the way the word is commonly used today, but it goes back to the original meaning of praxis, that is, of what people do. And this basically expresses the rituals, the actions, the forms of prayer, pilgrimage, everything that people do in their religious life. And the third is the sociological, the forms that people take socially in response to a religion. Now I'd like to go back and talk a little more in detail about each of these. The theoretical, as I said, encompasses myth and doctrine. Usually myth, in the sense of stories, narratives, is what comes first. And even before in fact, particularly before the invention of writing, stories, narratives told by bards and sages and so on, were the main way in which communication from one generation to another took place, in which the wisdom, the practices, the teachings, the rules, and so on that a society had developed were passed on. And I think it's very important to realize how important stories or myths are in religion. Of course, we're using the word myth here, not in the unfortunate common sense that it has today. When you say something is a myth, you mean, well, that's just something that isn't true. But in religious studies, myth has a deeper meaning than that. It means a story that whether or not it is literally true, conveys in story form the fundamental worldview, meaning of life, how to live life that is basic to that society. So I don't care whether you call it myth or story or narrative, but the important thing is that this is events that happen. And these are important, I think, to us human beings, because actually, of course, our own lives are stories. They're not just abstractions. We're not just a person who's always mean or always good or something like that. Our lives have stories in which we may find ourselves playing different roles at different times, in which hopefully at least we grow and change and develop our character in the course of the story. And every story needs to have something that has to be accomplished, some obstacle that needs to be overcome, and so on. And I think the closest way we can come to understanding these things in our own lives is by seeing them in terms of our life as a story, which hopefully will come to a happy ending. But it may go through a lot in getting there. So, first of all, religions have stories, and ones that will be familiar to many of us, of course, will be the story of ancient Israel and the Hebrew scriptures, the Exodus and so on, the story of the life of Jesus in the Gospels, the story of the life of the Buddha, the life of Krishna, the Srimad Bhagavatam, and so forth. These stories are important because they present kind of models of, at least in this tradition, a supreme story, a supreme life against which we can compare and often assimilate our own. But religions may go on from there to say, usually this happens in the earlier centuries of development of one of the great religions like Buddhism or Christianity and so on. Well, if we have this story in which God or the Savior did this and this and this and this at different times, what can we say about God that is true all the time? And out of this came things like the Apostles' Creed, say, in Christianity, the summation of doctrine and so on in the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita and so on in Hinduism, and so it goes. We can say then on the basis of abstracting from the story, God is always loving, is caring, good things happen to good people and so on, even though that may not always be easy to believe. But nonetheless, there comes a time when the stories are summarized in doctrines like this. Now, the next thing then, in the forms of religious expression, is the practical, what is done. And I think it's important to realize that all religions have some kind of practice like this, things that you do that you wouldn't be doing if you weren't part of that tradition, whether it's in private prayer and meditation, whether it's taking part in some very elaborate ritual like that of esoteric Buddhism or Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And I think the important thing is to ask the question, what is the message behind the message in this practice? And here I think you will find ways in which they give many different answers. If the ultimate purpose of religion is to open the doors to the other side, or maybe to put it another way, to get you out of the one-dimensionality of the present in order to experience something greater in human life and in the universe, how does this ritual do it, or this practice? They may not all be rituals at least in the common sense of the word. In a very elaborate and ancient ritual, I mentioned those, say, of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but many other examples too, you get outside the one-dimensionality of the present by doing something that has been done by this tradition for many, many centuries. And usually it's enhanced by evocative music, color, lights, candles, and all of that. A different kind of tradition would be one in which you get outside of the one-dimensionality of the present through releasing something deep within yourself. In Pentecostal Christian services, for example, speaking in tongues can do this. In the Quaker meeting, it can come simply in silence, but it's a silence that you wouldn't be having if it wasn't for this special occasion. And so it goes. So the important question is to ask then how does this practice help one to open the doors and windows to get outside of the one-dimensionality of the present? Then the third one is the sociological. What kind of groups does it form? Needless to say, religions around the world form an almost unimaginable variety of groups, everything from something like the Roman Catholic Church under the papacy to very small and sometimes very unpopular groups that are commonly called sects or cults, and everything in between. In the United States, so this is fairly unique actually in the world, although we don't always realize it, I think, if we're brought up with it. It's been called a denominational society, in which there are many different, more or less equal denominations in the country. Many others have just one dominant religious tradition, like Catholicism in Spain or Hinduism in India, and the others are often seen as minorities that are somehow outside the pale of that dominant religion, and this can sometimes cause trouble. In any case, there are many different kinds of organization within these too. Some of them are authoritarian, in which you follow the authority of a particular teacher or leader, or of a particular institutional figure like the Pope or bishops and so on. Others may be democratic, others may be spontaneous groups that are still in the process of resolving how they're going to set themselves up for the long haul, which is often a crisis of the second generation of a new religious movement. So you can look at the ways in which society is structured in a group and see what kind of message this tells you. What does it say about how the group sees the way to get in right relationship with the ultimate, to open the doors and windows? Sometimes it is, as I said, through a charismatic teacher who is thought, at least in the group, to have that kind of access and therefore ultimate authority. Sometimes it is more democratic in the sense, and not a judgment one way or the other, but in the sense that it comes out of all of the people in the group together. Sometimes it is something, as I said, that is kind of in process from one form to another. And so far as the nature of the group is concerned, again, there are some that are very small and intimate. People may be in close contact with each other or even forming communes or religious institutions like monasteries. Sometimes, on the other hand, it may be a very diffuse kind of group in which most people live their ordinary lives separate from the group but come together once in a while for their religious activities. So, in any case, the three forms of religious expression, the theoretical, the practical, the sociological. I wonder if you have any questions about this so far?
Yeah.
In order to get some discussion going.
Yeah, I was going to ask touch on the difference between esoteric and exoteric.
Right.
Is that...
Okay, well, esoteric means within, exoteric means basically without, and a group that has esoteric teachings usually holds that these teachings should not be accessible to simply anybody who walks down the street, but rather requires a certain amount of preparation, that you couldn't really understand them or use them, and indeed they might well be dangerous, like giving a powerful hammer to a small child or something like that, unless you were trained and prepared in its use. Sometimes esoteric groups are criticized, of course, for secrecy because we tend to have the idea that everybody ought to have access to every kind of knowledge, but they will usually respond that that something esoteric has to be, first of all, taught by someone who has interiorized it, who is a teacher or even a master of this wisdom. That you can't just learn it on your own out of a book, but it has to be transmitted by communication, you might say, from someone who has it. It's in a real sense caught, not taught, because you get it from that person. And people that follow it, of course, will also say that it has to be taught from the right person. It has to be taught when the student is ready for the esoteric teaching. In other words, when the child is old enough to be able to use a hammer or even a power tool, without running risk of hurting themselves. Right. And so you have to go through that and be at the right stage. Exoteric, of course, is the opposite. That means wisdom that is available to anyone who can at least read the books or whatever it is where they're found.
Okay, thank you. Oh,
now, there seems to be a tendency in some religions to persecute the esoteric aspect of the religion. Do you have any thoughts why that happens, if that is true?
Well, I think sometimes it's true, not necessarily always. We have, for example, in Japan, there is Shingon, which is a esoteric form of Buddhism, and ordinarily, anyway, to the best of my knowledge, it's not been particularly persecuted, although sometimes people have wondered why it has to be so esoteric, but they would say basically for these same reasons. And but of course, there's always going to be people who feel that anything that is kept secret, must be kept secret for a reason. And that reason might well, and probably sometimes is, invidious as well as just in terms of are people prepared for it. If the secret gives power, or at least even is thought to give power, as like acquiring a form of magic or something, then who knows whether that will truly be used for the good of the world or whether it will be used simply to aggrandize the magician who has the power. So I think feelings like that, plus the general obstinate human nature, not wanting somebody else to have something you don't have, I think comes into play too. I think it's going to be a question of, ultimately in the society, how important do people feel that this knowledge or wisdom is.
Most of the time when people study a religion, they're looking for the differences
Yes.
in each. Can you touch on how our study, or the study under the Theosophical umbrella?
Yeah, that's a very good point. In fact, I was going to come to that a little later, but that's good. Before I get into that, though, I'd like to talk about just one other thing, because I think that will help us to understand the differences, and that is the teaching centered around the idea of an axial age. And this concept came from a German philosopher, Karl Jaspers, and it's the idea that there was a big turning in human history, beginning at least around the 5th century BC. This was the time, roughly, when many things happened. Some of the greatest Hebrew prophets, the great Greek philosophers, the Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu in China, all did their teachings roughly around this time, which he calls the axial age. And I personally like to extend the concept of axial age to other great teachers that came a little later, such as Jesus around the turn of the millennium, of course, and the Prophet Muhammad about 500 years after that. Because this meant a tremendous change, not only in human thought through the philosophy, but in religion, because now we had religions that are based on a particular founder who appeared in historical time. Previous religions usually we're not based on any particular teacher, but we're based on traditions, myths, and so on of a tribe or nation that went way back to the beginning. Ordinarily, their big event was the big holiday would be New Year's, because that's sort of recapitulates the beginning of the world. The ancient tradition, which is that New Year's, in some mystical sense, we sort of go back to the beginning and recreate the world or start it off again. That's why many people do things that sort of lead to a sense of chaos on New Year's Eve, and then get up the next morning with new resolutions and so on. And that there's something to that. The ancient Babylonians, the king on New Year's Eve would sort of ritually fight against, play the role of Marduk and fight against Tiamat, an evil figure in the Babylonian mythology. In Japan, you have Shinto, which is very much a pre-axial age kind of religion. And my teacher, Michel Eliade, spoke of cosmic religion as over against historical religions. Cosmic religions being those that, like Shinto, have different gods in nature, and then center on the New Year's is the beginning of a new kind of life. But the other kind, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, three very prominent examples, are ones in which it was not the beginning, but rather the beginning, the creation also marked a time like what Christians would call the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden and so on, when people fell away from close relationships with God, and or with the ultimate enlightenment, as in the case of Buddhism, and then were able to, the historical figure showed them the way to get back into right relationships again, often through his personal teachings or power. And so these are historical rather than axial religions. Phyllis Brooks wrote the hymn, "O Little Town of Bethlehem, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." And that kind of encompasses it, because it means that at a particular historical moment, the birth of Christ in Bethlehem, according to the traditions anyway, the hopes and fears of all the years met there and were reconciled, not having to go back to myths of the creation, but to something new that happened. In the same way, of course, Jesus, the Buddha, and so on, started a kind of new tradition, which it's significant that the holidays of all these religions are not New Year's, but rather are the birth of Jesus and his resurrection, Christmas and Easter, the birth of the Buddha in Hanamatsuri, as they call it in Japan at least, and the same. And in Islam, of course, the great holiday is the time of the reception of the Quran through the Archangel Gabriel to the Prophet. So these are ones in which they center around a historical moment. And needless to say, today, I think the great majority of the world's population are affiliated, at least nominally, with one of these axial age religions. That's actually only happened incidentally in the last 200 or 300 years. As recently as, say, 300 years ago in the 18th century, the great majority of the population, at least in Africa and Latin America and so on, were still in tribal religions, which were basically of the cosmic religion type. But missionary activity by Christians and Muslims and others have changed that situation, so that now I think those that are still in what we call primordial religion, the word primitive isn't very much accepted nowadays, with wrong connotations, but the pre-axial religions, shall we say, are down to about 8 or 10% of the world's population. But anyhow, I think it's important to understand these two different levels. And so the first thing, if you were going to do a comparison, would be to compare the mentality and practice of something like Shinto or the remaining African or tribal religions of Latin America with those of the axial age religions. how are they same and how are they different. The Axial Age religions will not only have a founder, inevitably they will have a sacred scripture, a sacred text. In fact, I think you can make a case that what really sparked the coming of the Axial Age and its religions was the invention of writing, because that made it possible to take down historical events and teachings of sages and so on and pass them on. And so that you could no longer say that, well, every new year starts the world again, and we find that things change and they don't change back in the course of history. And so we have to deal with that. And one of the fundamental things of the Axial Age religions, actually, I think, is the way in which they try to deal with history, with the terrible things that happen in history, the hope of something at the end of time that will straighten it all out, and that sort of thing. Okay, so comparison. Recently, listening to a talk by Jack Kornfield, the well-known Buddhist teacher, in which he made the point that if you want to know where Buddhism really starts from, you have to go to the Four Noble Truths, because they're probably the most basic Buddhist teaching, and the first one of those is the truth of suffering. All life is, well, I won't say all life is suffering, although sometimes translated that way, but I think that's misleading. But what it is saying is that in all life, as it's ordinarily lived, maybe what Socrates would have called the unexamined life, you have a lot of suffering, as well as a few good days too, I suppose. And that led me to think about how could I carry this over to other religions? In Christianity, it may be a little more difficult to say exactly where it starts, but I think you could take, say, the Lord's Prayer, which is probably the Christian thing that most people know better than anything else, and start, and where it begins, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. I think that gives a kind of insight into the basic nature of Christianity as it would be experienced. The kingdom is a rather mysterious idea, but it was so fundamentally basic to Jesus' preaching, because it's both within us and in the world around us. It's both here now, and yet it's also coming. And if you can get all of that somehow assimilated, or at least open yourself to the mystery of it, then I think you're getting close to the heart of Christianity, in the same way that in Buddhism, if you start with suffering, and I think many people today come to Buddhism, and it's popular because it, we have experiences of suffering in our own lives. That doesn't mean that people are like that are particularly self-centered or anything. It's just very basic to human nature. We have problems in our lives, problems with health, mental and physical, problems with relationships, problems with family, problems at work, and everything else. And Buddhism, I think, very rightly provides ways of dealing with this, basically through compassion and meditation. In Christianity, the kingdom come, thy will be done. It suggests something a little more abstract, I think, to many people, and sort of imposing the will of God on the world and so on, but on the other hand, it suggests that there is or could be at least, a process here, which I think is what Jesus meant, by which the world as a whole and all individuals in it at the same time can be brought to something closer to whatever is meant by the kingdom of God. And you can go on from there. See, I have a note here on the Analects of Confucius, the basic teachings of Confucius, the ancient Chinese sage. Is it not pleasant to learn with constant perseverance and application? And I think there's a couple of things that are important there about the nature of Confucianism. One is that Confucianism, above all, is a process of learning. The sage, great master Kung Fu Tzu, as it would be in Chinese, taught that we need to continually learn and grow. And this is fundamental to Confucian society, to education, and so on. And the teaching, though, is not just abstract teaching, but is also teaching with application about the right relationships between different kinds of people, the application of the basic principle, don't do to others what you would not do to yourself, in our social interactions and so forth. In the Tao Te Ching, the other great Chinese text of Taoism, the first lines of the Tao Te Ching say, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the real Tao." And maybe you can get an idea there about how this is dealing with a way of experiencing life that is not just based on words, which they always accused the Confucians of doing, but rather is based on something deeper or beyond words that is simply somehow known. And in the case of Islam, maybe this will be the last one I mention, but it's the 5 pillars of Islam are what is basic to that tradition, maybe a starting point. The first one, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And that's the basic teaching, I think, of Islam, that there is a ultimate conscious reality, Allah or God. And Allah is not a name, incidentally, it just means the God, the one and only God in Arabic. And of course, very important is the idea that Muhammad is his prophet, or Rasul, a word which could almost mean ambassador, I think, as well as prophet. But be that as it may, that there is a all-powerful reality and there is one central revelation of the nature and will of that reality.
All right, I just have 2 things to wrap it up.
Okay.
One, you talked about learning and growing,
Yes.
which is what our goal is
Right.
for this year of study. So can you give us any hints or suggestions that will help prepare us as we study each religion, on its own, and then
Yes.
in the light of Theosophy?
Yeah. Okay. That's a big order, but I think it's
Yeah,
very
sorry.
important. I think that the reason why I presented this material the way I did is because I think when you come to each religion, you may want to analyze it in terms of the 3 forms of religious expression. What are its stories? What does it teach? How do you practice it? And there again, there would be practice both in groups, like rituals or services, and individual practice, like the way people pray, meditate, do pilgrimages, stuff like that. And in sociological, how is it organized? Now, for some people, this may be more on the level of information. They may not feel that they're called to do those particular practices and so on, and that's all right. But I think that study of world religions, like any human study for that matter, is more than just information in a bare bones sense of the word. It's because it's really a way of experiencing our common humanity. I would go so far as to say that it's really an expression of love. If love means anything at all, it means being able to get inside of another person's life, to see the world through his or her eyes, to walk in his or her shoes, as they say. We can never do that perfectly, of course, but we could always draw closer and closer to it. And so I think that studying world religions, whether or not you intend to follow a particular religion, if it is seen as an expression of love and understanding in itself, is a way that can advance your spiritual growth. And I'm sorry to say, in the world today, there is still a tremendous amount of prejudice against different religions that you can encounter here or there. People that obviously have simply taken some stereotype of that religion, that have not taken the trouble not only to get to know people in the religion and find out what they're really like on a personal level, which often will be very different from the stereotype, but will not even be an attempt to try to have this inner vision, seeing the world in another person's way. So that's one thing I think we can do in the study of religion.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was very good. Any other questions? No? Okay, Robert, any last words before I cut you off? Or, sorry.
My last words.
But yes.
Well, no, all I would say of the last word, I think, is just to really try application of what I just talked about, seeing this as a human understanding and not just academic information.
Okay, very good. So we thank you so very much for kicking off our year of study. If anybody listening to this, I'll put all the information below the video so that you can join us, look us up, find more information. So with that, we bid you adieu, and
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you very
And
much.
as I said earlier, I will be very happy to answer anyone's questions or discuss with anyone who wants to contact me. I would prefer they do it by email, but my phone, but if it's absolutely urgent, they can do it by phone too.
Okay, we'll get all that
that's fine.
information out.
Okay, good.
Yes, thank you.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here.